the real goal for today is to have as much conversational and kind of focused discussions. And as a lead into this, I'm looking at Mel Davis right here, and we were sitting at a conference, one of the many that we both seem to kind of circle around. We have these kind of orbits that keep on intersecting, partly because of his job with NATCA as kind of the NextGen focus point, and part of my job as the first vice president tasked with overseeing safety and technical programs. And it leads right into some of the comments that Congressman Lobiondo left us with, and also with Paul and Lee, and that's what is NextGen? You know, I'm an Alaska Airlines pilot. We've been flying NextGen since 1996, but if I go to 100 of our pilots and ask them what the whole concept is, I would probably guess that somewhere in the high 80s to maybe 90 would understand that we have NextGen refrigerators, NextGen airplanes, NextGen bicycles, but as far as referencing it in terms that relate to the job that we do day in, day out, namely flying performance-based navigation, satellite-enabled approaches into places such as Juneau, and that clearly there was a business case and a safety case for us to go there. There's this kind of disconnect there. And I think that's kind of part of the reason, and we're kind of hit ourselves over the head, why haven't we done this sooner? Why haven't we started establishing kind of a baseline frame of reference for what NextGen really means, and not from the, not necessarily the manufacturer standpoint, the programmatic standpoint, but from the end users, the folks that are really tasked with making these programs, making the rubber hit the road. And in that sense, we're very, very agnostic. We fly Boeings, Airbuses, regional jets, all kind of different walks in life. And we have one goal in common. We want to see those vectors, those lines intersect with regards to implementing these programs. So that kind of leads us into the What is NextGen panel. Since 1995 and the publication of RTCA Task Force 3, Flight Implementation Report, the aviation industry has been talking about NextGen, although we didn't necessarily call it NextGen then. There have been many formal plans and reports. The Joint Planning and Development Office, otherwise known as JPDO, was established to coordinate the efforts of 8 different government agencies, which, as I'm sure you would agree, is no mean task in and of itself. All of us have attended many, many conferences and symposiums discussing the programmatic issues surrounding NextGen, but not necessarily the implementation or the execution issues. As Lee said in his opening remarks, and as our conference theme says today, we're focusing on the line pilot and the controller and our perspectives as end users. In this panel, we're going to discuss how NextGen is viewed by the several stakeholder organizations and their interaction with various aspects of NextGen. And as you'll soon hear, NextGen does not necessarily mean the same thing to each one of our groups here. What is important to one group may not be as important to other groups. And the goal, of course, then, is to find common ground so that we can rapidly move forward with the development and implementation of new NextGen tools for pilots and controllers. So again, everybody has the panel's descriptions and the bios, but what I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to give them an opportunity to give some comments and go into the Q&A, and that's going to be the format for today. But I'm going to do a little bit of a twist. I'm going to introduce the panelists here. I'm going to give you my perspective on what I think the key role that they play is before I turn over to the presentations. So first seated to my left is Captain Chuck Hogeman, a good friend of mine and somebody I've had the privilege with working with for going on 3 years now. Chuck is the Aviation Safety Chair for the Airline Pilots Association, and as such, he is tasked with overseeing the key safety elements of what is actually the biggest, largest non-governmental aviation safety agency in the entire world. And he oversees all of the critical elements, the technical specialists that oversee aircraft design, ground operations, air traffic systems. I see her chair right back there, as a matter of fact. And as such, he is indispensable as the centroid for a lot of the technical activities that we do at the Pilots Association. Directly to Chuck's left is Trish Gilbert, the Executive Vice President of the Air Traffic Controllers Association. Basically, Paul's, I was going to say right-hand man, but right-hand woman would be more appropriate. And Trish, from her experience as a frontline controller and also as a participant in many, many panels and technical events in the country, brings basically the perspective of the frontline user and brings it into these key meetings where we can interact and make sure that we're actually interacting and meshing our programs appropriately, both at the, as we saw at the programmatic level, the national level with our presidents, and also on the many, many working groups that we seem to get involved in. Scott Foose is the Senior Vice President for Operations and Safety for the Regional Airline Association. People think of NextGEN as sometimes being, a heavy metal kind of project, 737s and bigger airplanes and whatnot, but it was interesting that I was talking to somebody just before the conference began, and we were talking about some of the learning curve issues and some of the human factors elements with younger pilots, younger crew members coming in and entering the commercial world through the RJ industry, and actually some of the challenges and actually some of the advantages of doing so. Chris Oswald, to his left, is the Vice President of Safety and Regulatory Affairs for the Airports Council International. And one of the things that we often associate with NextGEN is we think that NextGEN happens above the tarmac, above the runway. But NextGEN truly, when it's fully built out, is going to be an end-to-end program. And we need to think of it as an ecosystem, a system of systems. And you can have all the efficiencies through ERAM and optimized arrivals and all these wonderful RMP-enabled approaches. But the fact of the matter is, if you get on the ground and you don't have a precise, coherent way of getting ground traffic, both from the gate out to the runway and airborne and vice versa, then that's an issue. And you can actually even extend that to the safe and efficient travel, secure travel, and movement of passengers through the airports. And then finally, to Chris's left is Mitch Fox, who I've got to know over the past few years and have a tremendous amount of respect for the daunting task that he has before him, because he's the chief of the flight operations section, for the Air Navigation Bureau for ICAO. And I was just at a conference that talked about trying to mesh NextGEN with CESAR, which is basically the European equivalent of some of these air traffic modernization improvement programs. And Mitch is taking an incredibly important task, and that's providing the global template for worldwide harmonization, because after all, many of our crew members, they may take off from Dallas, but they may end up going to Toulouse. They may end up going to Paris and Tokyo and other places. So there has to be a complete harmonization, integration to remove some of these hurdles, especially for international operations. So with that's my introduction. That's my perspective on the importance of all these panelists. I'm thrilled to have them here. And now I'm going to turn over to the statements, to the introductions, starting with Chuck.
Thank you, and good morning. Thank you, Sean. It's an honor to be here. I've been given the opportunity here to give you the perspective from 35,000 feet, from the pilot's perspective. As Sean mentioned, I have the privilege of working with some very, very dedicated technical volunteers that are involved with many of the NextGEN projects, such as Datacom, Airspace Optimization, ADS-B. So I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of PowerPoint slides outlining exactly what we're doing, but I'd like to share with you for the next couple of minutes some of the perspectives and what are ALPA's goals as NextGEN comes online. And one thing that kind of impresses me is the fact that NextGEN is never going to be finished. NextGEN is a process. Again, as Sean mentioned, it started out, as NASMOD, and it may be called something else as we move down the road. But it's going to be a process that's going to have to grow and accommodate change. It's going to have to accommodate technology changes, aircraft changes, airline structure changes. It is something that is a very living, breathing process. And we're never going to be able to throw it down on the desk and say, there, we're done with NextGEN. It will go on probably indefinitely. There are three areas that ALPA, kind of coalesces around as far as our values with NextGEN. And I'll give you those three, and then I'll speak in detail to each of those. Number one, we want NextGEN to certainly improve safety. And certainly we have to maintain the existing level of safety we have. And our goal is that we want NextGEN to take it to the next level, to improve safety. Our second goal is that we want to have pilot-centric solutions in the work that is done in NextGEN. And I'm sure NATCA has the same value as far as the controller force. But as we direct our project work in NextGEN, we are looking for pilot-centric solutions. The pilot is involved. And then finally, global standards. See the establishment of global standards and interoperability of NextGEN concepts. Sean alluded to, the metaphor of the highway. And, NextGEN is building the next superhighway. And, a way of thinking about it, what we've been tasked, all the stakeholders in building NextGEN is like saying, okay, we've got to replace the Washington Beltway, and we've got to put this absolutely superhighway in there with a whole bunch of exit and off ramps. And we've got to do that at the same time and yet not disrupt existing traffic at all. And when you think about that, that is really a challenge in a very, very dynamic environment that we find ourselves. NextGEN and carrying that out is truly a challenge. And there's always going to be safety challenges in that. And we've got to make sure that NextGEN can accommodate the increased traffic levels that we're likely to see. And we will see that through better information, certainly better information in the cockpit, which will lead to enhanced situational awareness, and better tools for both pilots and controllers. Now, as we talk about pilot-centric solutions, we have to make sure that the pilots are aware of air traffic control policies and procedures. We've got to keep the pilot in the loop. Pilots have a terrible time with blind faith. We have to be involved in managing the flight path of our aircraft from start to finish, and NextGEN needs to support that. I had an interesting discussion last night with Patrick Foray. He's the former president of NATCA, and he brought up an interesting point to me. He says, we talked about technology and we talked about automation, and we tend to use those terms interchangeably. Automation is your thermostat. You set your thermostat, you walk away, you never think about it. But when you think about it as an airline pilot, I can't really think of anything I do in the cockpit that I do and I am able to walk away from it and not think about it. I constantly have to monitor. I got to make sure that it's doing what I told it to do. And technology, if we move it over towards looking at the technology is always going to be changed. And we have to make sure that the technology is up to the task of carrying out what we're going to do in NextGEN. And I think the most important thing is technology is a tool. It is not the end. It is a tool. Our prime responsibility as airline pilots is managing the flight path of that aircraft, and we've got to be at the center of it. One last point on that is that, we are given latitude that during an emergency situations that, we can have all the expectations of the world, but NextGEN and the process that's designed needs to be able to accommodate the possibility that we have to deviate from that and get our aircraft safely on the ground. As we speak about global standards and interoperability, harmonization is one of those terms. We all know what it is. It's all-worthy goal. There are a number of success stories in harmonization, but as Mitch is probably first to admit, it is a very, very tough thing to bring about. We believe that, particularly as we get into some of these next-gen concepts, that ICAO is the perfect forum for talking about that. A patchwork design of NextGen or Cesar or any air traffic control modernization issue is something that we need to avoid. We need to develop standards and protocols for pilots to be able to take off from the United States, go to Europe or Asia, and feel relatively comfortable in that air traffic environment, just as pilots from the Far East or for Europe coming to the United States need to feel comfortable and understand the expectations. And so we will continue to engage, certainly at the ICAO level, through our ALPA partners. As we look into aircraft design, flight management and merging aircraft functions with navigation is not just a matter of pushing buttons. There's a lot of neat things we can do with our existing technology, but there is a limit to our cognitive abilities and our capacity to process information. As we move forward with NextGen, it would be my hope that we could focus on specific and agreed-to tasks in developing cockpit procedures in navigating through our future airspace system. There was an interesting article in Aviation Week in Space Technology in April written by John Croft, and he was discussing the interface between pilots and their aircraft. And certainly in a next-gen concept, I think it's appropriate. It's a starting point, and it could be arguable. But basically what he was proposing is that we need to give the pilot what he or she needs, but we need to only give them what they need and only when they need it. And the information needs to be intuitive. And from a broad perspective, I think that's a good way to go as we start developing specific tasks, as we retool and re-engineer our airspace system as far as what our pilots are going to be doing. Speak just briefly here about training. A lot's been said about airline pilot training over the past couple of years. And I think as we get into some advanced concepts with NextGen and air traffic control, that we are going to have to refocus how we train our existing pilots and our future pilots, particularly in the concept of spatial orientation. To most airline pilots, we have the point of, we don't want to find ourselves where air traffic control wants us to go down and slow down. Pilots think in terms of energy management. Controllers think in terms of aircraft separation. And as we build training programs, that's a concept that we're going to have to merge, and pilots are going to have to be aware of in their training and the expectations out of the line. I think we need to identify common flight management tasks that are within the bounds of air traffic control so as to maximize the benefit of fuel management, environment, noise, and airport capacity. We're going to have a new generation. Every day we have a new generation of pilots. And certainly the air traffic controllers are seeing a new generation coming in. They're going to be very savvy on technology. But I think that we, certainly from the pilot perspective, need to focus in on that spatial orientation. We have spent 50, 60 years drawing lines on a map. But that's not what NextGen is about. NextGen is going to be a four-dimensional approach to navigating through airspace: latitude, longitude, altitude, and time. And we're going to have to get that into pilot's training and a pilot's approach to navigating in the national airspace system. And my last point is there has been some talk that NextGEN will give onboard capability for pilots to maintain air traffic separation. ALPA's policy is very clear on this, that when it comes to aircraft separation, we will only accept separation provided by air traffic controllers, and we are not willing to maintain our own separation. That is a function that needs to be left to well-trained professional air traffic controllers. So with that, like you, I'm looking forward to hearing the comments from our other panelists and the rest of the day, and thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Chuck. And before we kick over to Trish, I just noticed that Chuck is also a NextGEN presenter, looking at his little iPad too that he's reading his notes off of. I could probably use some of that as well. So moving over to our traffic controllers, I think hopefully if one thing that we've imparted on the audience is the importance of very, very tight and well-orchestrated teamwork, because having the pilots manage separation, having the pilots manage the flight plan, there's still a complete other dimension to that, and that's what lies with the air traffic controllers. Both certificated professionals, both licensed individuals, and this team is tasked with the safe movement of the safest transportation infrastructure in the entire world. And over to Trish, and thank you for being here.
Here's my iPad too, right here. I do love technology, I do love my phones, and I can't believe I survived decades without an iPhone, but now we all love it. And that is the same with technology with air traffic controllers. From that perspective, I want to at least give you a little bit of background about what an air traffic controller is before I get into what is NextGEN and what are our goals and challenges. It's a very small workforce, relatively speaking. Only about 12,500 certified controllers across the country, moving 70,000 takeoff and landings every single day. That many planes in the sky, around 4,000 to 5,000 at any given time, during the daytime and early into the evening. So it is a relatively small workforce. It is also a workforce full of type A personalities, which I'm sure the pilots are as well. They don't give up at all, ever. And you don't want them to. When they're plugged in and they're working traffic and it gets complicated or complex, or there's an emergency situation, and it seems undaunting sometimes, they stay plugged in and they figure out a way to make it work. That is no different when we ask them to get involved in redesigning airspace or technology projects or anything that we ask them to do. They give it 100%, and when things get difficult, they actually enjoy that a little bit more and figure out a way to get through the challenges and make things work. So simply put, controllers will figure out a way to make whatever gets implemented work. And I will still, something that a colleague of mine from across the pond in the UK said, which is our reality working with the FAA for the last 25 years that I've been there, is that for years we've had to make things work because we weren't involved. What the FAA tends to do, and still at sometimes are doing it, is they decide they need a dog, and they buy a cat, and then when the cat doesn't act like the dog, they bring the controllers in to teach the cat how to bark. And that's the kind of thing that we've been dealing with for quite some time, and still a lot of our challenges. ERAM is an example of that. Some of our training also is lined up with that. I can tell you, while collaboration is probably the buzzword of this last couple 5 to 10 years, it hasn't always been like that. And while collaboration is where everybody is driving towards and stakeholder involvement is key, and I don't think anybody disputes that, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to make sure that all the stakeholders are involved, because it's not happening everywhere it needs to happen. And Chuck and I were talking last night at the reception, whose responsibility is it to make sure that all stakeholders are involved? And I would challenge that it's really not just the FAA or the government or Congress's responsibility, but it's all of ours. If we're in a room and we're trying to figure out what are the challenges behind greener skies, which we've had a little bump here and bump there, but we're figuring it out, we should ask the question, is everybody in the room that needs to be in the room? Because if not, if you wait too long, it ends up frustrating, those that have to, the end users of the system or the procedures, and it takes longer and costs more money to get things done. So I would challenge the whole room to say, as we participate, regardless of what it is, we make sure that we take on the responsibility and ensure that everybody in the room that needs to be in the room is there. Controllers have been, in addition to the challenges of bringing on new technology later in the stage, if you brought them in earlier, which the FAA is doing now in a lot of cases, you end up getting the dog that you really needed and not trying to teach the cat how to bark. But that's where we are now. Unfortunately, at a time when they're collaborating at a level I've never seen, we have the external challenges with regard to funding and extension after extension on the FAA reauthorization bill and government shutdowns, and a turnover in our workforce. A very small workforce that has still about 2,000 controllers that are in training, and 3,700 of that 12,500 eligible to retire right now and could very likely go out the door tomorrow, depending on what happens on the Hill. So while there are many challenges, and the FAA is collaborating at an unprecedented level, it's even more important that we figure out, those of us in industry and in the room, how to include everybody that needs to be included and make sure that we're putting things into the system that truly work and that don't cost more money than they should. And I think we're getting there, regardless of the challenges. But from the simplest of terms, the controller just wants it to be safe and they want it to work. And if it's not safe and if it doesn't work, they'll figure out a way to do that. But we can't continue to depend on that. We need to get in front of it at the beginning and actually deploy things that are safer and that work. Lee said it in his opening remarks about, actually, I think it was Paul, I get them confused now. They're a little too close. That we already have NextGEN in place. And we do. I worked at Houston Center for 21 years before coming to DC as Executive Vice President. And the Gulf of Mexico has been a challenge for many years. And I don't know how many of you are familiar with the airspace there, but for decades, well, forever, we couldn't talk to planes above 18,000 feet. And so we'd have to increase the separation going across the Gulf of Mexico. Even though there's technology out there that would give us the surveillance that we need to put planes closer together, and there's technology out there so we can communicate with the pilots, yet we're having to go through AirRink and pay a great amount of money to talk to the pilots through AirRink. Why is that happening? So, we're getting there. We've got surveillance in the Gulf of Mexico, and I consider that to be NextGEN. That is improvements in the system. That is safety enhancement. That's capacity improvements for the system. We're seeing it in improved approaches or improved departures out of Atlanta, 132 departures an hour, which is really probably great for the airline, specifically Delta, I believe. And there's the ability to do that in a lot of the other metropolitan areas. We just need to stay together as a team, include the controllers and the pilots. And I think the controllers are being more included than I've ever seen them, but I still see the pilots being left out of the equation in quite a lot of the activities that we're participating in. And I think we need to probably step up a little bit more as an organization and demand that we have more pilot interaction and input as we move forward on a lot of these things. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to any questions that you have.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Trish. And I'm just going to serve notice because I've taken notes while you're speaking. And once we get into the Q&A, I'm going to be fascinated to maybe have you deep dive a little bit into the green skies thing and some of the ways that we debugged it and we made it more efficient through direct interaction and stakeholder involvement. And it's a perfect segue moving over to Scott Foose with the Regional Airline Association, representing a lot of the other practitioners of NextGEN right in our own backyard. So over to you, Scott.
Thanks, Sean. Good morning, everybody. Actually, I bought the same version of the iPad as Trish. Actually, I have two. I have 1 and 1B here as well, which is actually some notes I took during the opening comments. I thought they were really tuned up, set us up very nicely for this conversation as well. And I think I'm probably the only person that brought a slide or two, but there's one slide in particular that I found. It's really pertinent to this conversation, and let's see if I can do this without messing it up too badly. So One of the conversations that started out this morning talked about best equipped, best served, BEBS. What is it? Well, we're going to talk about what is NextGEN from our perspective. But I think one of the important messages I'm here to talk about is really that any solution, regardless whether it's ground technology or airborne technology on the aircraft, really needs to not only encompass, of course, the involvement of the controllers and the pilots, which I absolutely agree with, but also certainly the manufacturers and the airlines as well. And this graphic really drives this point home. I think that many people don't really truly understand the importance regional airlines play in today's air transportation system as well. There is a number out there that we talk about. We, the regional airlines in the U.S., provide half of the domestic flights in the system, which is an interesting number. But when you look at this, what you see is that we not only provide the vast majority of the service at small and medium cities, but our primary role continues to be the same as it was when I started my career. It's hub feed. We fly from the small and medium cities and we fly into the hubs, and the vast majority of our passengers connect to flights and go elsewhere. So if you look at the graphic, you do see the hub cities represented here. Point to Chicago. The orange part of that circle is the regional airline flights in Chicago. All the domestic hubs, if I can use kind of a loose term, international hub versus domestic hub. The domestic hubs, we are more than half the flights in most of these cities. Chicago is a good example, Philadelphia is another. So really at these hub airports where BEBS is going to be a key factor, if it does not accommodate the regional airlines, and that is of course not only the legacy RJs, they're flying today and still doing a great job, but also the new RJs that are coming on board and the turboprops. Obviously a much smaller part of our fleet these days, but still key to many of these cities. And why is it so important not only to us, but to the communities we serve? And I think the chairman put it best, it's jobs. That is one of the key hot buttons, not only here in Washington, D.C., but at the communities you see on this graphic as well. I come from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. It's the capital of Pennsylvania. And there we have about 40 commercial flights, passenger flights a day, serving 7 destinations, but only 2 of those are main lines. That's a fairly typical representation of what you see in a medium city around the airport. And if we cannot get those airplanes into the destinations, Chicago, Charlotte, New York City, Atlanta is where many of those flights go, then Harrisburg and many other communities and 160 million passengers that we carried last year become landlocked. And what does that mean? It not only means jobs lost and economy lost in Harrisburg and communities like them, but also the pilots, mechanics, flight attendants, dispatchers that also support those operations. So I think it was important to mention, Sean mentioned that we have to think not only in Boeings and Airbuses, we also have to think about Bombardiers, Embraers, ATRs. Mitsubishis will be coming on soon as well. So that's important. The key points here, BEBS needs to consider, of course, the regional factor for this reason. It affects jobs locally as well as nationally, and it's important to the feed, particularly of our legacy carrier partners as well. One of the other points I wanted to make had to do with NextGEN capability. We've been talking about, of course, wrapping ourselves around NextGEN, and for us, for me, I'm a pilot, so I like the technology. I like the technology in the cockpit, although we didn't have too much when I was flying. If I got into a cockpit today, I'd probably be lost. But more importantly, at least from the airline perspective, and particularly from the regional airline perspective, the technology is not the end game. The end game for us is increased efficiency and increased reliability. Back when I started my career, we could fly a Convair 580 from Pittsburgh to Philadelphia. It took about 50 minutes. Today, you can fly a 737 or Airbus, and it takes an hour and a half to do that same route. And we all hope that NextGEN will solve this problem. We haven't seen it yet, but we're hoping it'll go in that direction. But that's what we need to see. We need to see, of course, a return on that investment. NextGEN is going to be incredibly expensive, has been, will be. I've heard the phrase often talked about as CNS ATM. What does that mean? You know, ComNav surveillance, air traffic management. But in the words of a stakeholder that's, I don't think here, but somebody we really need to understand their concerns and their issues, is the CFO, the Chief Financial Officers at the airlines. They're the ones that need to pay for those cool, neat stuff. All it takes is money, right? So we need to learn the language of the CFOs as well. And this is a task that RA's Flight Technology Committee has been taking on for the past 8 years. And they've really worked very hard talking to CFOs and trying to understand what they need to really justify and make the business case for the advanced technology in a forward fit as well as a retrofit fashion, which we're going to need to do someday. And it's been a tough task. One of the things, though, that we're seeing most recently, which is really interesting, I mean, a return on investment has been an issue we've been talking about for years in regard to NextGEN. Task Force 5 took this on and struggled a bit with it as well. But something has emerged most recently, and there are two examples I wanted to mention. One is, of course, the Alaska Air Group has been one of the leaders in navigation technology. Both Alaska Airlines and their sister company, Horizon Air, who's an RA member as well. Horizon Air added WAAS to their Q400 fleet as well. And we've thought all along, I thought all along, that the advantage of adding RMP and WAAS LPV technology is the fact that you could land on the other end of the runway from the ILS, or you could land at airports or runways where there was no ILS. But ultimately, the business case, and we looked at this at 6 different ways, was not necessarily access. Now, certainly in the Northwest and other areas, it is quite an important part of the equation. But the vast majority of the airports in the U.S., the vast majority of the airports that regionals operate into in the U.S., they have an ILS. Many of them Cat 2. So what we found the advantage is that we were able to pull in, use more alternates and more alternate runways closer into the destination. And that means 2 things for us. One is you have to carry less fuel, and that's less weight, so you burn less fuel as well. And also because of your capability to fly RNAV routes or to fly RMP routes, you can actually shorten those routes. So it's not the end game, it's not the approach, it's the reduction in fuel burn as well. Horizon's realizing millions of dollars in savings every year as a result of this technology you put on the airplane. I think that's important to remember because when we're speaking to the CFO, that's part of the business case. And that's one of the solutions that I think is very measurable and will be a stepping stone to get our aircraft actually updated. Both the new airplanes that are coming on, which they have great technology, but we still have to make that business case to the CFO who makes the business case to the CEO to make sure that the new airplanes that are being brought on have that capability. And then in the future, of course, as some airplanes are being phased out and others are being retained, we have to make decisions on whether we're going to retrofit as well. Last point, and last slide as well. And I think it plays well into what Trish was talking about as well. PBN, Performance-Based Navigation Procedures, really gaining traction. Air Wisconsin has about 40 flights a day into Washington National with their CRJ 200 aircraft. A lot of their flights come in from the cities in the west of DCA are using the new OPD arrivals, and they're realizing about a 10% reduction in fuel burn on those arrivals. Each one of those arrivals, about 10% reduction in fuel burn from top of climb, to be sure. One of the other key players, of course, is the OEMs. making sure that the OEMs are involved in finding solutions. We've got ADS-B deadline coming up. We have some RMP opportunities coming up as well. We need to make sure that we have technical solutions to those opportunities, and that needs to be done through collaboration between the OEMs and the operators. CNS goals. Many of you realize that these fuel benefits, the fuel bill, oftentimes because of the capacity purchase agreement, is actually being paid by the major partner. So the benefits to reduce fuel burn is being borne, of course, by the code-sharing family as a whole in better efficiency, but also by the major partner as well. So I really think we need to look at developing CNS goals with a coordinated effort between the regionals and the majors within the code-sharing families. Lastly, we touched on it earlier, sequestration really had a huge impact, of course, on the progress of NextGen itself as well. One of the concerns we have, it's an ongoing concern, is for approvals from the FAA, both for certification and new certificates, but OpSpecs approvals of new procedures. If the FAA does not have the staff actually to not only approve these procedures and change the OpSpecs, but also surveil the operations as they obviously are required to do, then we're not going to get those approvals. We're going to have all this cool, neat stuff on our airplanes, but we're not going to have the paper in our ops manuals really to allow us to use it, and that's a huge concern. So I appreciate the opportunity, offer some thoughts on this, and look forward to hearing everybody else.
Thanks so much, Scott. Kind of going back to one of the points that you made about flying from Charlotte up to New York or wherever on a Convair versus, a 737. I hear that a lot, and I can't help but wonder if some of it is just because of the density of travel, because of the volume of travel, relatively speaking. But the other part clearly must be the integrated phase with the en route down to the terminal phase, because it's one thing to have the ability to manage a certain density of air traffic for the en route portion. It's another thing to manage the safe departure and efficient departure and arrival flows because of the key role that the terminal operations play. And I think that's a perfect segue to move over to Chris and give it from the airport perspective.
Sure, and thanks, Sean. Thanks for having airports here. We're always pleased when we're included, of course, in NextGen discussions. I think many of you who've seen me talk before, always, our first point would be that NextGen begins and ends at airports. Our great catchphrase, because the flights do, of course. But I think the involvement of airports also need to be out front, and really do appreciate your willingness to get us involved in the symposium here today. I think for airports, in trying to answer that question, what is NextGen? It's a complicated answer because there isn't a uniform, I think, understanding and a uniform need for NextGen at airports or for the operators that we represent and for the broader airport community. When you look to a number of GA airports in the system, those that serve business aviation, oftentimes access is going to be the most critical issue that they might be facing. We look to the opposite end of the spectrum, to domestic and international hubs. It's really going to be about efficiency and capacity with a view towards how do we also manage some of the environmental issues, primarily noise, that constrain operations at our airport, that constrain future development opportunities at our airport. So there isn't an easy one-size-fits-all definition of NextGen for an airport. And that's, again, why it's so essential to get the airports involved early in the planning and programming process, to get them involved, much like Trish had mentioned, early in that development process, so that there's an understanding of what capabilities FAA and those that are going to be operating in the system day to day are intending to provide. One issue that probably is a common thread with all of you, though, is that safety is going to be a common starting point for everything that goes on. And I think probably in a lot of the capabilities that have been discussed or promised, and certainly our members understanding those capabilities, those safety limitations are not all that well understood, or maybe not uniformly understood. For a long time, I think going back to when I was an airport planner and a consultant that worked with airports to try to solve capacity problems, the promise of closely spaced parallel approaches, kind of this holy grail for airports. How do we make maximal use of runways that might be separated by 1,000 feet? You look to 900 feet. You look to something like a Newark, or to San Francisco, how you expand capability in IFR conditions to match what goes on in VFR. The promise, I think, out in the early 2000s was one that seemed almost unlimited, that we were going to see NextGEN deliver simultaneous instrument approaches at 1,000 feet runway separation. I think that was never completely realistic, and it's something where if we had started with the realities, if we had started with, I think, a discussion of maybe we can get to 2,600 feet, that's where we should have been in the early 2000s. Not really looking at something that might be difficult to deliver ever. So controlling those expectations, controlling what the near-term and mid-term end games are. I won't even mention far-term because I think that becomes very, very speculative. Are also critical issues for our constituency, because they're looking to plan. They're looking to understand, where should I place that runway if I've got a capacity issue? What access advantages am I likely to experience as a really a recipient of the benefits of these procedures? And then when we get into PBN design in particular, what are the likely impacts, realistic impacts, on the communities surrounding my airport? And how can I begin communicating and begin selling those capabilities earlier to broader constituencies, as I think New York has done for a number of years with its partnerships. Other airports, I look to the Atlanta capacity increases, which are great. I think Denver's done a good job too. And when we look to greener skies, I think there's been a great partnership there in finding the synergies and trying to sell to a much larger constituency than maybe those affected communities, which can help us to expedite deployment of those procedures, can help us to avoid after deployment problems that are going to crop up. We've seen this certainly for airports for over 30 years with new runways, airfield infrastructure, new runway use patterns that might evolve, where 6 months after, maybe 3 months after deployment of the procedures, you have significant community outcry. So how do we manage that in advance? The answers really are through that early collaboration with airports. Kind of strayed from that initial topic on what is NextGEN. Just to come back to that initial bit, it's really from an airport perspective about what needed capabilities of my facility are and how it helps me to manage the problems that problems and issues that I see at my airport. I wanted to come back to something, Sean, you introduced me really with, or in your introductions, and referred to some of the surface systems. And for a number of the larger domestic hubs, for a number of the larger international hubs, those surface solutions are key, and that's something where the end-to-end solutions, when we look to apron and ramp management, gate solutions, how we involve the non-movement area into NextGEN, are issues for a subset of our members, but certainly an important subset. Core 30, I think actually probably even a little bit smaller than the Core 30 group. And I think they're very, very interested in how they can participate fully, I think as full partners, meaning full access to information, full access to data exchange, which are struggles that we're working right now, to ensure that those systems function well. And to ensure that we're making full use of capabilities and information that the airport operators are in a unique position to provide. So certainly that'll be an important area as well, important capability for a subset of our members as well. And with that, thanks again for having us. We really appreciate being here.
Absolutely, and thanks for bringing the perspective from the airports to the discussion, which absolutely is important with the end-to-end kind of philosophy of NextGEN fully built out. And now I'm going to shift over to Mitch, and I think that's a perfect way to kind of wrap up the panel before we go into Q&A. And because, like I said in the intro, he has one of the most daunting tasks of everybody here, and that's figuring out how this kind of global integration can move forward, safely and effectively, dealing with an organization that represents, what, about 190 member states? Close?
191.
191, okay.
Soon
Close
to be
enough.
192.
Okay. Off to you, Mitch.
Scott, can I borrow the switcher? I promise not to do death by PowerPoint. I was so pleased to hear the Congressman in his opening remarks talk about the importance of full engagement with the practitioners, the user community. This is, I believe, how we avoid those barking cats out there. So let's take a look at NextGEN and look at it in the context of the overall Global Air Navigation Plan and what we call the aviation system block upgrades. We have an issue to deal with in the future. It's good and it's bad. The issue is that in the next 15 years, it's projected that air traffic around the world, in all regions of the world, will double in the next 15 years. This is based on airframe deliveries. It's based upon the airframes that will retire over the next 15 years. That's an incredible challenge. In one region alone, in the Asia-Pacific region, we're looking at air traffic tripling in the next 15 years. That's a huge challenge. And we have some costs to bear. It's a double-edged sword. If we do nothing, there will be some direct costs that we have to face, and that will be congestion, delays, passenger complaints, all those types of costs that are associated with that Convair 580 that could fly from A to B in 45 minutes versus a 737 that takes an hour and a half. We'll need to deal with that. But there are some indirect costs that we also need to deal with. And that is if we increase the amount of air traffic with the same capacity that we have today in the next 15 years, that will impact safety. We have no doubt about that. So we have to deal with these issues, and as Lee said, we need to start dealing with it right now. If we don't deal with it right now, the system is intolerant to an increase in aircraft accidents and incidents. So that would artificially constrain what should be a burgeoning growth. This growth is important not just to your industry. I think it was very interesting in Paul quoted some figures that the aviation industry contributes overall about $1.3 trillion to the economy of the United States alone. I'd like to cite one particular example of what can go wrong and what the cost is to the economies of the world. In 2011, April of 2011, a little volcano went off in Iceland, and it shut off some airspace in Western Europe. There were millions of passengers inconvenienced. There was hundreds of millions of dollars of cost to the airlines. But overall, for Western Europe, there was over a 10-day period of time, there was an approximate $5 billion impact to the economies. This is huge. So your industry contributes enormously. So our challenge is to have this continuous growth, but to maintain and improve the safety of the system. Now, what ICAO is very good about doing is being what I would call a bridge builder. That's our job. As an international community, we build the bridges. So as you well know, NextGEN is happening, SESAR is happening. There are other air navigation system improvements that are being implemented on national basis all over the world, like carrots, for example. And what is extremely important is that we are an international community. When you can fly a 777, for example, between almost any two city pairs in the world, if we don't build bridges if we don't have interoperability and a harmonized approach globally, then you'll be flying to the least common denominator. So if you're flying from, I think Delta has a flight from Atlanta to Delhi. If the least common denominator, or you have several least common denominator FIRs in between, you won't see the improvements. So building those bridges, harmonizing the initiatives that are going on in different parts of the world, along with providing the path for developing countries that may not have the wherewithal to be able to improve their air navigation systems is absolutely essential. So, how did we work forward? Well, let's talk about practitioners, the stakeholders. We worked with what we call the technical team over the last few years in building what we call the Global Air Navigation Plan for the future and the aviation system block upgrades. I put a few logos up. That's just some of the logos, but certainly the pilots and the air traffic controllers were intimately involved in this and will be intimately involved in this, as were the airports. So this is something it's a team effort to make these types of improvements. And this led up to the block upgrade strategy. I've been around ICAO for a couple of decades, so I've seen things come and go. I've seen the cats, I've seen the dogs. And one of the things that I've seen in terms of a transition in our approaches over the years is that if you go way, way, way back to what we call the FANS Committee, the Future Air Navigation System Committee, some of you around here will remember that, we kind of started out with the CNS part of CNS ATM. Well, gee, we've got the technology to do almost anything. We can overcome this line of sight issue. We can provide better surveillance over remote areas and oceanic areas with something called, at that time it was just called ADS. We didn't have a B or a C. And we could do all this stuff with the technology. Then all of a sudden we came to the realization, after we came up with lots of standards for CNS, we should have an operational concept behind this thing, the ATM part. Maybe we should have called it ATM CNS. So we've gone through quite a big transition, especially as it regards the block upgrade strategy. The block upgrade strategy starts with what operational improvements do we seek to have? Start with the operational improvements first, not with the technology. And once we define what operational improvements that we wish to have, then define the enablers. The enablers, of course, are the technology, but most importantly of all, the humans that support that technology. I heard the pilot-centric approach. The air traffic control-centric approach is also important. So we defined human performance issues in the aviation system block upgrades. So that includes both the human factors issues, but also the training issues that are necessary to support this. We also realized that not one size fits all. If you look globally, here in the United States, with your air traffic representing about 40% of the traffic flow today, it's an extremely sophisticated system. Your needs may be different than the needs, for example, of what we call the African Indian Ocean region. So we didn't want to be too prescriptive, yet we wanted to make sure that all the parts of this puzzle, this Rubik's Cube that you see in front of you right now, are interoperable and one part builds upon another part. So let's take a look at the upgrades. We have performance improvement areas, for example, airport operations, things like interoperability, optimum flight path, those types of improvement areas. And then we have blocks that go along a time frame starting in 2013. So yes, as Lee said, we need to start right now in terms of what we're going to be doing in NextGEN, but also all the other initiatives throughout the world. But following a path, following this aviation system block upgrade path that provides the harmonization that's necessary for the entire global system to work. As you go across, you'll see those little blocks within each one of the vertical columns. Those are called modules. So there's flexibilities in terms of the modules that country by country, region by region would implement to provide an optimum situation for the states and the country and the regions involved. What's very good about the system block upgrades is it provides a planning horizon, financially speaking, that we've never had before. Make no mistake about it, there'll need to be billions of dollars of investment put forward globally in order to make this work. But what countries, regulators, airlines are adverse to is surprises. If you're planning financially, you don't want to have a 10-year period of time to plan. You want a couple decades to plan. And that's what the block upgrades provide in a series of 5-year increments, starting in 2013 to 2028 and afterwards. What we tried to do in these slides is have a look at what the block upgrades mean from the flight deck perspective, but also from the air traffic controller's perspective, but putting it in plain language. What does it mean? So things like arrival management, departure management, how those would improve over a period of time. I do want to point out, and I'll click through these slides very quickly, the Block 0, that's starting in 2013. One of the things that Block 0 represents is using the technology that we have on board the airplanes already. So there are airplanes, both the heavy metal and the regional airplanes that are rolling off the assembly line today that have lots of technology, but unfortunately, we're not using it. And the plan for Block 0 is let's use the technology we have on board the airplanes without making further investment, at least in the airplanes in this 5-year block. Three of the high priority items that we see in our Block 0 are continuous descent operations, continuous climb operations, and implementation of PBN. And we know that that is challenging throughout the world. It was mentioned in terms of the FAA issuing the operation specifications, but throughout the world, what we call operational approvals are a huge challenge. In addition to that, from an international perspective, the recognition of operational approvals given by one country by another country is becoming a huge issue, and this is something through the ICAO mechanisms that we need to approach. And then as we go through the subsequent blocks, one block builds on another block as we move forward into a more efficient system, but also a system that maintains the safety levels of today and we hope improves upon those safety levels. So, what are the challenges ahead from an ICAO perspective, from an international perspective? I think we have two major challenges ahead. The block upgrades are defined, they've been approved by the Council of ICAO in September of this year when all 191 countries that are members of ICAO get together. We'll be looking for a full endorsement by the Assembly of the Global Air Navigation Plan and the Aviation System block upgrades, but we do have challenges ahead. Certainly the investment, I'll be very interested to hear what people have to say about the financial aspects of investment in this system are. We certainly feel that because we started with the operational benefits, it certainly will provide our finance people with a lot better argument into the future. Best equipped, best served. That's a huge challenge, especially if you balance that out with something called access and equity. Huge challenge ahead. Very controversial worldwide, but it's something that we need to work together with the practitioners ahead because we know that this is a major challenge. I also mentioned that the blocks and their modules, they're optional. You don't have to implement all of them. However, if we're going to get true harmonization and true interoperability, then there needs to be a minimum path. And we have not yet defined what that minimum path is through the block upgrades. So those are our future challenges. We look forward to working with you together on those. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Mitch. It kind of hit me right between the eyes when I was thinking about some of the comments that Scott had about the ability right now. I mean, in a Block 0 point, of operations where we could get, we have the crews trained on board the planes, we have the equipage on board the planes, and we have the ability right now to see a 10% improvement in fuel economy and fuel efficiency, which really hits on, basically the trifecta of NextGen, which is safely driving up efficiency, increasing efficiency, doing so in a safe manner, and also being a great steward in terms of carbon footprint and fuel consumption and reducing delays. And it's amazing that right now that we could see a world where an operator could go out and realize a 10% improvement in one of the biggest fixed cost components of their operation, and it's just theirs for the taking. So I'd like to ask the audience to join me in a round of applause to thank you so much for setting the table here.